Hello and welcome. I'm Jono Hayes and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. President Vladimir Putin turns down the idea of Western security in Ukraine and warns Russia will make foreign troops legitimate targets. Meanwhile, Hamas released a new video showing hostages pleading with Israel to halt its Gaza offensive. And Trump set to rebrand the Department of Defense to the Department of War, a move that's part of his administration's Warrior Ethos campaign. Russian President Vladimir Putin has turned down the idea of Western security in Ukraine, claiming it would make troops legitimate targets. His comments come after a Coalition of the Willing meeting took place in Paris yesterday, where 26 countries pledged deployment of reassurance force in Ukraine the day after any ceasefire comes into place. Putin said he was ready for a contact with Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky, but added he did not see much of a point, claiming it was nearly impossible to reach an agreement with Ukraine on key issues. Take a listen to this.
Regarding potential foreign military contingents in Ukraine, it is one of the root causes behind drawing Ukraine into NATO. Therefore, if some troops appear there, especially now, during military operations, we will proceed from the fact that these will be legitimate targets for destruction. And if decisions are reached that lead to peace, to long-term peace, then I simply do not see any sense in their presence on the territory of Ukraine, full stop. Should such agreements be achieved, let no one doubt that Russia will implement them in full.
We're now joined by the defence and security analyst Tobias Ellwood. Tobias, thanks for talking to us. First of all, Macron saying 26 allies are pledging troops by land, by sea and by air. So how strong do you think this commitment really is from a European perspective?
Well, good evening. In your summary there, you actually gave a good indication that there is a division between what America is thinking and what Europe is thinking. The best scenario has always been when Europe and America are on the same page, supporting Ukraine and Ukraine's objectives and standing up to Russia. But what we've seen since Donald Trump came to the White House is his insistence to somehow stay close to Russia, to bring Putin in from the cold, to agree a deal with Moscow. And it's forced European countries, for the moment, up to this point, to agree to Donald Trump's direction of travel, support that Alaska summit, and bring Russia to the table. The consequences we've seen since then is the devastating missile attacks on Ukraine, on Kyiv, the capital as well. And something which I think is a bit of an eye-opener is those images from China this week of Putin and Xi rubbing shoulders together, and a bigger concern as to where our global order is going. And this is why there is that coalition of the willing meeting in Paris, because we recognize the picture. Putin's long-term intentions are not peace, and we really would like America to get this.
Tobias, let's talk about the UK, which of course has been one of Ukraine's staunchest backers up until now. What role do you see Britain playing if this reassurance force ever materialises?
I think that's a really good question. And the knee-jerk answer is, oh, boots on the ground. It is more complicated than that. Britain has a history going back over the last couple of centuries of stepping forward when European security is in peril, going back to Napoleonic times. And we did it again in the last 2 wars. We're not the same power as we were before, no doubt about it. But the fact that we are willing to step forward and encouraging others to do so, I think is very symbolic about our concerns of wider European security, our commitment to Ukraine, but also to stand up to Russia as well. I would stress that this boots on the ground is shorthand. Journalists like it. It is more complicated than that. It would probably start off with a no-fly zone, because that's the easiest way. You need to control the skies above before you even think about putting troops on the ground. But it raises that bigger question about long-term security. If you can't provide Ukraine with any form of long-term security, then the clear European position is all that we'll see is Russia step back, rearm, regroup, and probably do this again in a couple of years' time. And that's, again, another message that we want Washington to understand.
Risks involved as well, and let's talk for a second about Putin and his warnings that any foreign troops would be legitimate targets. Tobias, is that going to deter European allies, or maybe that even stiffens their resolve, you think?
No, you're absolutely right to ask that question, because go back to the very start of this war back in 2022, and there was this constant messaging from Moscow. Every time we considered sliding across another weapon system to Ukraine to help them, we got this rhetoric from Putin, and the West was spooked, if we're honest. We had public debates, if you recall, about whether a weapon system was offensive or defensive, and discussions about main battle tanks, F-16, long-range missiles. That should never have been in the public domain. We should have been far more committed. We've lost that Cold War statecraft, if you like, to look our adversary in the eye, conscious of the escalatory ladder. You don't want things to get out of control, but knowing how far you can push your adversary before things tip over. And we've lost that art completely. And here we are again with Putin pushing back, saying, you dare do this, you dare put foreign troops on the ground or have any form of foreign capability to boost Ukrainians' defense posture, and we will respond. Well, let's be stronger than that. Let's be tougher than that. Let's not blink.
Let's talk about Ukraine and the promise that they've been given of EU membership 5 years from now, by 2030. What do you think Moscow would make of that? And how realistic actually is that timeline?
You know, this is really interesting. You visit Ukraine and you actually realize that, sadly, it hasn't advanced. It hasn't moved as fast as some of those other countries that came out the traps at the same time. When the Soviet Union fell, you know, you go to Poland and look at how they've advanced. You look at the Baltic nations, they're all doing incredibly well, partly because, yes, they've also joined the EU. But ultimately, Ukraine has stayed behind. The oligarchs, the corruption, it's not advanced. And one of the things that scares Russia is to have a state as big, as large, and economically eventually as powerful as Ukraine being an exemplar as to how things should be done. And that's the last thing Putin wants. He's got Belarus up there, which is a complete basket case. And so he wants a buffer zone so Russian people don't look over their shoulders and say, hang on a minute, we want our economy to work a bit like that. And that's, I think, at the heart of what's driving Putin to make sure that that's why he wants to be encouraged to invade Ukraine in the first place. So this desire to join the EU, to upgrade the economic capability there, and to introduce a less corrupt society is all, I think, good news for Ukraine. The Ukrainian people will actually want it, and it's well overdue.
And of course, Putin has been quite vocal in the past about Ukraine's potential NATO membership and also European Union membership as well. But could NATO get involved if things escalate here, do you think?
Well, again, that's another good question. I mean, the EU side, the economic side is one thing. The security angle is another. And the hesitance from Donald Trump to say we're not going to provide that security is a real blow to the Europeans. We need America and Britain, as I stressed, on the same page here, looking after European security. That is what NATO was all about. In my view, NATO did blink at the very start of this. We had a choice to, as the troops were building up before the invasion took place, to slide a couple of NATO divisions, and probably a coalition of the willing, because not everybody would have agreed, into Ukraine, and then absolutely look Putin in the eye and say, you dare to invade a sovereign state, and you're going to get the might of the most potent military alliance looking at you in response. And we didn't. We decided to say, well, look, Ukraine's not a NATO member. We're not going to bother with this. Well, Afghanistan wasn't a NATO member. Neither was Bosnia, I don't think, or Iraq, all these places that I've been involved with. And yet there we are giving up simply because it was a cop-out, in my view. And the deterrence of stopping a superpower, or certainly a regional power like Russia, pushing in from the east failed. And therefore, NATO should really galvanize itself and recognize that because it didn't do the right thing at the right time, Europe's security is all the much weaker right now.
Tobias, we couldn't have you on without discussing this, but the UK's now former Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, has made the decision to resign. So how's the mood within Starmer's party on the back of this announcement?
Well, you're asking me that question when it's still unfolding. I've just learned that Britain now has a new foreign secretary, Yvette Cooper, who's, I think, very competent and capable and will do well on the international stage. But it's one of those things. It's some detail to do with her own personal housing situation that then escalated, wouldn't go out of the front pages of the media here, and became the story itself that she couldn't actually do her work. That's prompted a much wider cabinet reshuffle that we're, as I say, just learning about as well. But at the same time, Reform, which is this up-and-coming party, are having their conference today as well. So it's multi-party politics in the UK. Everybody's adjusting.
Indeed, perfect timing from Reform. Tobias Elwood in London, thank you so much for joining us. Let's return to our top story right now. John Kavulich is the Senior Editor for Outcome Modelling Analysis at Issue Insight. John, thanks for joining us. Trump has said he's going to speak to Putin very soon. What is the impact that we could expect that to have? And will Ukraine be relying on Trump taking a direct role on these ongoing negotiations?
Publicly, President Zelensky is going to continue to rely on President Trump. Privately, President Zelensky knows that he can't rely on President Trump. The same goes for NATO not being able to rely on President Trump, nor the European Union able to rely on President Trump. So you have what's in the public domain, what's in the private domain. And for President Trump's discussion with President Putin, the historical trajectory suggests that whatever President Putin says to President Trump will again avoid saying that President Putin lied to him. President Trump continues to say President Putin disappoints him, that he's angry, that he does something different than he suggests or indicates he'll do, but he'll never come out. He hasn't yet come out and said, President Putin has lied to me. So if history is the judge, we're likely to see nothing definitive, but more potential dialogue.
Well, John, Washington hasn't detailed the contribution that it could have to this coalition just yet. We may have more on that after the call. Do you expect the US to commit to boots on the ground? Is it going to limit itself to funding and logistics in this war?
The key is, that we have this coalition of the willing. It seems more like the coalition of the unsettled, the coalition of the uncertain, the coalition of we don't really know what we're going to do. Politicians love macro statements. They love to talk about the big picture. Ukraine's places in the EU, Ukraine's places in NATO, as long as it takes. But once they get to the micro discussion, as we've seen this last week and this week, then all of a sudden you get uncertainties. Well, we're not talking about troops in Ukraine. Well, we're talking about maybe supporting this. Well, maybe we'll talk about logistics. Well, maybe. And it becomes maybe. And that's the biggest problem that Ukraine is going to be facing, is the fact that the coalition of the willing isn't really willing to commit to anything. And there will be no security guarantees for Ukraine. Even the words are thrown out: security assurances, security goals, security cooperation. The simple reality is that when it comes to putting troops on the ground in Ukraine, muscular offensive and defensive capability in terms of equipment, no one really wants to do it. And more importantly, very few members of the EU and NATO can afford to do it. A quick note on that: Keir Starmer has promised Ukraine a little more than $3 billion annually for the next 100 years. Now, he's going to have to stand for election within the next 4 years. And his current budget deficit over the next 4 to 5 years is $45 billion. During that time, they promised Ukraine $15 billion. So a third of what their shortfall is, they're saying they want to send to Ukraine. Is that sustainable? Government of France, that may fall. A new government, are they going to want to be spending anything on Ukraine. So there's just a lot of dynamics here that don't look good for Ukraine.
Well, Putin is talking about these security guarantees or assurances, as you put it, John, that they also have to apply to Russia. So how do you think that's likely to play out in Washington? What would it potentially look like?
I'm going to guess that what President Trump may gravitate toward is less of a discussion about, we'll call them security guarantees, about the direction of the coalition of the willing, until there is either the ceasefire that President Trump has wanted, or there is some sort of agreement where the military operations of both countries have ceased, whether it's an armistice, a freezing in place, whatever. I think that what President Trump tries to do is to remove the complicated stuff and go to the core where he can get something he wants. So with these trade deals, he'll, even though they're very intricate and they have a lot of details, he'll just grab out the parts that he likes, and then he'll say, see, we have a success, even though it's still being negotiated. And so what he might say to President Putin is, all right, we're not going to talk about what comes after in terms of the military component. Let's just talk about what Ukraine needs to do to get you to stop firing into Ukraine. So that may be one of the outcomes.
John, this as well is complicated in terms of the policies, US domestic policies and politics that take place. It complicates it even further. There's division between Democrats and Republicans on Ukraine as it is. And a lot of the rhetoric seems to be this is a European problem for European funds to manage. Is that what you're seeing from your point of view as you are in New York? Do you think that that may be the feeling with the general consensus and the public, the voting public in America?
Well, you're right to separate it all out, because you have, members of Congress, the 100 members of the Senate, the 435 members of the House, who generally have been supportive of Ukraine since the 24th of February, 2022. And then you have who's in the White House. In Biden-Harris administration, they were all in order, not necessarily for Ukraine to win, but for Ukraine not to lose. President Trump comes in and says, no, we've got to figure out how to end this. And so you have this, this collision course, but in the end, the U.S. Congress, the majority being Republican and being controlled by President Trump, they're going to basically go along with what he wants. They're really not going to try to push him toward anything he doesn't want to do. In terms of the public, we have a divided electorate, and generally President Trump is going to just focus on what he needs, what he believes he needs to do to keep his MAGA base, Make America Great Again base, content. And so again, in that regard, he's likely to not want to push too far in the envelope, because he campaigned on, hey, I'm not getting into wars. I'm going to get us out of wars. I'm not going to be spending a lot of money overseas. And if you've looked at the last couple of weeks and what President Trump has said, if you're NATO, if you're the European Union, he has continually pulled back from either commitments that they thought he had made, or he's brought in new ones. And so I think that there's going to continue to be a pulling back, where President Trump is going to say Ukraine is Europe's problem, and Ukraine is not NATO's problem. Ukraine is individual members of NATO who may believe it's their problem, but as a collective, it's not our problem.
John Kavulich in New York, thank you so much for joining us. Hamas has released footage claiming to show 2 hostages taken during the October 7th attack on Israel. Both are alive and in Gaza City. The video shows one hostage urging Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not to launch a full-scale offensive as Israel continues to intensify strikes on Gaza. Local authorities say that at least 19 people have been killed today in Israeli attacks, while protests mark the 700th day since the conflict began. We can now go live to Tel Aviv to speak to our correspondent Blake Sifton. Blake, what has the reaction been in Israel to the video of the hostages?
Good evening. The family members of the hostages have reacted to this video, and it's just piling more pressure on the government to do more to win their release. The family members of one of the young men in the video said, "We are deeply concerned for their lives. They must be brought home." Opposition leader Yair Lapid said that the video is another painful reminder that Israel must return to negotiations and try to close a deal. On the other side, far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, he called the video psychological warfare by Hamas, trying to stop Israel from launching this offensive into Gaza City. And he said that the only response is full occupation and massive migration. Only then do we win. Now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office issued a statement saying that the Prime Minister had spoken to the family members of the hostages in these videos, and he then reiterated that Israel will only stop fighting if Hamas releases all of the hostages, if Hamas disarms, if Gaza is demilitarized, and if a new entity that's not Hamas and that's not the Palestinian Authority governs Gaza.
This video reportedly has been filmed in Gaza City, but that's quite significant. Why is that, Blake?
That's right. The video shows a young man being driven through the streets of a city that is reportedly Gaza City. And it's been very rare for Hamas to film and release video of hostages above ground. It's being viewed as an attempt by Hamas to sway public opinion here in Israel against this offensive, this planned offensive to seize and occupy all of Gaza City. In the video, the young man says that if this offensive goes ahead, that the hostages, including himself, will remain in harm's way in Gaza City, and that Hamas will move them to the areas where the fighting is taking place. Of course, the family members of the hostages held in Gaza, since this offensive was announced, and certainly since it's begun, they have been terrified that this offensive will see harm come to their loved ones. They've called it a death sentence for the hostages. And today, Friday, they said in a statement that they have spoken to the military, and the military also believes that this offensive will put the hostages' lives in danger, and that the military does not have precise intelligence on where in Gaza City the hostages are being held.
Well, now we know that the Israeli military say that they control 40% of Gaza City. So what are the latest developments on that?
The military operations on the outskirts of Gaza City have been intensifying. These have been targeting neighborhoods like Sabra, Shajaya, and Zaytun. The Israeli military says that they are destroying Hamas infrastructure, including tunnels, but residents have reported widespread destruction of buildings as well as civilian homes. The United Nations have also backed that claim, and satellite imagery has shown that large swaths of these neighborhoods, the targeted neighborhoods on the outskirts of Gaza City, have now been reduced to rubble. Almost completely flattened, and there are reports that they've been bulldozed. And just today, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said that the gates of hell are opening in Gaza City. Moments after he spoke, the Israeli military issued an evacuation order for a 12-story high-rise building in western Gaza City, an area that had been mostly untouched up until this point. And then afterward, Israeli Air Force jets bombed and destroyed that building. And the Israeli military has said that in the coming days, they will continue to strike high-rise buildings in western Gaza City that they say contains Hamas infrastructure.
Blake, protests there in Tel Aviv are marking 700 days of this war, and families are calling for some sort of a deal at this stage. How much pressure is that really putting on Benjamin Netanyahu's government right now?
So that's right. Today we've seen protests in various parts of Israel. There's been demonstrations in front of the homes of ministers, in front of the home of President Herzog. And tomorrow on Saturday night, there's expected to be a very large protest outside the home of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And while the protests are certainly intensifying in recent weeks after this offensive to seize Gaza City was announced, and public opinion is for the most part on the side of the family members of the hostages, many people here believe that the the true power to influence Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu lies with his far-right coalition partners, for whom he depends on for the survival of his government. They are completely against a ceasefire. They've been against every ceasefire throughout the war. They want Gaza reoccupied. They want the Palestinian population displaced, and they want Gaza resettled. And they have threatened repeatedly that if Netanyahu reaches a ceasefire, that they will leave his government and they could collapse his government.
Lake Sifton, live in Tel Aviv. Thank you for joining us. Afghanistan has been struck by a fourth earthquake in just 6 days, causing further panic and disruption the ongoing efforts in the country. The latest magnitude 5.4 tremor hit the country's remote southeastern region at a depth of 10 kilometres. The victims continue to be hampered by the lack of international aid. Patrick Falk has this report.
Villagers of Dari Noor district in Afghanistan's Nangarhar province surveyed the damage following yet another earthquake. Many of the homes here have been reduced to rubble. For some, the pain of losing everything is too much to bear. Here in Kunar province, families have been left sheltering under tents after some villages were completely leveled. The fear of further quakes has kept Nazar Shah and his family of 15 on edge.
The danger of rockfalls, water flowing down from the mountains, and earthquakes, along with fear of God, has left us shocked and distressed.
Kunar province has been hit with the highest number of casualties. The houses here are mostly built from wood and mud bricks, making them highly vulnerable. Nazar's mother was among those injured and needs looking after.
Our request to the government, the international community, and the people is to help and support us. Our homes have been destroyed, and we're living outside under tents. We have no food, no blankets, and no shelters.
The mountainous terrain has been hindering relief efforts. Adding to the difficulty, the lack of international aid flowing into the country. Since the Taliban seized power in 2021, it's been difficult for NGOs and aid groups to function in Afghanistan.
Afghanistan is experiencing several overlapping crises at the moment. Droughts, return of millions returnees, refugees from Iran and Pakistan, deadly floods, and now we have earthquake.
Survivors face a bleak future. Global aid agencies are warning the funds that are available for food, shelter and medicine are dwindling. Patrick Falk, Al Arabiya English.
Now let's take a look at some of the other stories that are making the headlines today. At least 15 people have been killed in Sri Lanka after a passenger bus veered off a cliff. Police said another 16 people have also been injured, including 5 children. The bus collided with a car before hitting the road railing. An 11-year-old boy who was killed in a ding-dong ditch prank will be laid to rest on Saturday. Julian Guzman was shot dead when he knocked on the door of a home in Houston, Texas, as part of the popular game. Police have charged a 42-year-old man with murder for the shooting. Former US President Joe Biden has undergone skin cancer surgery months after revealing his stage 4 prostate cancer diagnosis. The procedure involves removing layers of cancerous skin cells. Now, Biden has had several non-melanoma skin cancers removed in the past before he became president. A federal appeals court has overturned a legal order requiring Florida and the US President Donald Trump administration to shut Alligator Alcatraz last month. A US district judge ordered a halt to the expansion of the facility, as well as for the center to be dismantled within 60 days. President Trump will sign an executive order today that will mean the Department of Defense will now be known as the Department of War. For now, the department will use the new name as a secondary title whilst the administration waits for the US Congress to approve the order and make the change permanent and official. For more on this story, we're joined from Washington by our correspondent Sarah Firth. Sarah, Thanks for joining us. So a little later on today, President Trump is expected to sign that executive order that we just mentioned, which rebrands the Pentagon as the Department of War. Give us an idea of just what's behind the change, but also how significant is this change?
Yes, so in just over an hour's time, we're expecting that executive order to be signed by the president, and a rebrand, it seems, likely to be underway for the Department of Defense to this Department of War. Now, this is what the department was originally called. And, Jono, we've got an administration document that has described the changes and some of the reasoning behind this. And it said that restoring the name to the Department of War will sharpen the focus of this department on the national interest and signal to adversaries that America is ready to wage war and secure its interests. Now, of course, it is expected to be a pretty big change. You're not going to have the seal of the Pentagon changing overnight, but this is Trump-era politics, right? So the wording matters. And this is really being seen by both those who are supportive of the move and critics as a real signal, not just to adversaries, but to allies as well, that potentially the US is shifting its focus now from deterrence with the Department of Defense to potentially a more confrontational role here. And so that's raising both concerns and praise in various quarters. But you mentioned there, it will need congressional approval if it's to move beyond being this secondary title. And of course, all of this is going to come with a pretty hefty price tag.
Let's talk about beyond the symbolism here, Sarah, because is it maybe likely to change how the actual US military operate, or is that not going to be the case?
Well, this is one of the things that skeptics are pointing to. They are saying that, look, you've got China, for example, expanding its forces in the Pacific, and that there is simply this money that is going to be involved in changing when it comes to, yes, the symbolism behind this, the signage, the names on letterheads, for example, all of that bundled together, that money actually could be better spent elsewhere where it's really needed right now within the military to ensure military readiness to tackle these various issues as they come up abroad and secure Washington's safety in the future. Now, what you've got in security circles here in Washington, D.C. is real concern being expressed over this shift in focus from, as I said, from deterrence to a more confrontational role with that wording, the Department of War. You've had the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, being asked about this. He's been a little bit cagey, Jono, in what he's willing to say. We're expecting perhaps a little bit more detail after this executive order is signed. We know this is in line, right, with President Trump and Secretary of Defense Hegseth's sort of warrior ethos that they've set out this kind of mission for the Department of Defense. But how much will it actually change the game on the ground? As I said, skeptics say this money simply could be better spent elsewhere, and there is real concern about the messaging that this is sending out to the world. It's such a difficult time in many regions across the world.
Speaking of that messaging that's been sent out, America's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, he has said that the US, and I quote this, will find these people and blow them up. Now, he's talking there, Sarah, about foreign crime groups, specifically in Latin America. What does that tell us about the administration's approach here? But also, is that potentially going to affect relations with countries such as Ecuador?
Yes, I mean, this is, again, the signaling, right, from the Trump administration that they're going to be carrying out that campaign pledge that came from Donald Trump to really crack down on these drug cartels. But such stark language, you know, we're used to this from the Trump administration. This is the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, speaking on his visit to Ecuador, using that very tough language. And at one point saying, when it comes to these organizations that are illegally operating, often using countries like Ecuador to carry out their illegal activities, that he said, frankly, it's war. We've seen this announcement that they are willing to take more violent action and support countries like Ecuador, governments who want to be cracking down on these organizations. They want to be providing this support, and they're willing to carry out, it seems, these more violent strikes. And it comes, of course, on the back of Thursday's lethal attack on one of those ships that the president of the administration has said was being used for illegal drug smuggling. That led to to 11 deaths. That ship leaving from Venezuela. That story, Jono, very much developing today. We're getting new information all the time as that tension with Venezuela ratchets up. But Marco Rubio's stance was really saying to Ecuador, look, he announced at the same time there are two groups that were operating within Ecuador that are going to be put on that official foreign terrorist organization designation by the United States. We've seen under Rubio a number of these organizations in Mexico and in Venezuela already being labeled as foreign terrorist organizations. So it's an expansion of this action to try and crack down on these drug groups and this activity. But with these very real actions come very real repercussions, and we're seeing some of that playing out as this story develops.
Sarah, whilst we have you, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. today has been getting quite a lot of flack, but he's defended the major shakeup at the CDC in that very heated Senate hearing that we saw earlier. Give us a brief overview of what happened there. What were the key points from that testimony that we saw?
Yes, it was really heated. You had Robert F. Kennedy defending some of his decisions that have been made. Some of those were involving the staffing at the CDC and cuts to that staffing that we've later learned from some of those people who've been fired. They say they were basically told to go along with some of the changes that were being made, even if it wasn't backed up by scientific evidence. You had that marathon 3-hour session with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. facing that really tough grilling from both the Democrats and the Republicans. Like Jono, Democratic Senator Michael Bennet, he really went in quite hard on Kennedy about this firing of all the members of the CDC. Take a listen to what he had to say.
I will hold you to that, Secretary Kennedy, because this is not a podcast. It is the American people's health that's on the line here. This is the last thing, by the way, our parents need when their kids are going back to school, is to have the kind of confusion and expense and scarcity that you're creating as a result of your ideology. I think it's critical for you to share the evidence that this panel will rely on. Will you give the American people 6 months or 6 weeks in advance the record that they're going to rely on to make these decisions? Will you make it transparent for the American people?
All the evidence is transparent.
Will you make it in advance transparent for the American people so they can comment on it?
All the evidence is transparent for the first time in history, and you were never there complaining when the pharmaceutical companies were picking those people and then running their products through with no safety testing.
You can characterize it any way you want. I quoted them today. What I said was accurate. What you said were lies.
Sarah.
And Jono, just for everyone that's watching that, you have actually had this argument around some of these changes, right, that's being made. The reason that it's raised tempers in this way is that the limitation of the COVID-19 vaccines, for example, has meant that different states now have different levels of access to that vaccine. You've got states where the elderly, higher risk people haven't got the same level of access that they had. And so really there's a lot of controversy around these decisions that Robert F. Kennedy has been making. And important to note, not the only one to be accusing Robert F. Kennedy of lying. You've also had in the wake of that testimony a former CDC official saying that he had lied to Congress. So a really fiery exchange, and that situation very much still very controversial with the access to these vaccines across different states, very patchy. But, Jono, importantly, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he got the seal of approval from the president himself, who, after that testimony, has said to reporters, look, I like the fact that he's different.
Well, September certainly has been a busy month in Washington. We're only 5 days in. Sarah Firth in Washington, thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at some of the top business news for today. US President Donald Trump has signed an executive order slashing tariffs on Japanese car imports from 27.5% down to 15%. The deal, which Tokyo says will boost US-Japan trade, also includes billions in Japanese investments and expands access for American goods. Shares in Toyota, Honda and Nissan have all jumped after the announcement. Lululemon shares have tumbled more than 15% after the company warned that Trump's tariffs and the end of a duty-free loophole will cost it nearly $240 million this year. The Canadian retailer slashed its sales outlook, saying higher import costs will weigh heavily on its US business. And a final reminder of our top stories. President Vladimir Putin turns down the idea of Western security in Ukraine and warns Russia that he will make foreign troops legitimate targets. Meanwhile, Hamas released a new video showing hostages pleading with Israel to halt its Gaza offensive. And Trump set to rebrand the Department of Defense to the Department of War, a move that his administration had as part of their Warrior Ethos campaign. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget, as always, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can follow us on X. The Real Deal with Tom Burgess-Watson is coming up next. And plus, we'll be back in just a couple of hours with the very best of this week's W News Extra. But for now, goodbye.